Hi, everyone. So first of all, thank you for coming, and thank you, Professor Preston, for hosting the session. My name is Noah Riley, and I'm a senior studying economics and international relations with concentrations in Asia and foreign policy studies. And today I will be introducing the process and findings of my thesis, addressing ambiguity, a roadmap for US-China engagement on strategic nuclear issues. So first, I'll be introducing my research questions, followed by a brief discussion of the relevance of my paper to the study of international relations and its broader goals in proposing concrete policy recommendations to an issue near the heart of American foreign policy. Then I will be discussing the importance of arms control, the objectives of the US in engaging China, and describe a number of bilateral initiatives that should be pursued to address strategic nuclear issues. So first, as you guys can see, these are my three research questions that I focused on. One being, what should US-China bilateral arms control be structured to achieve? Two, how should the US engage China on arms control? And three, do potential areas of cooperation exist under the umbrella of strategic nuclear issues? And if so, what? So first, I wanted to touch on the relevance to the study of international relations. Nuclear weapons, arms control, and strategic deterrence have long been examined in academic circles, and beginning in the 1960s, nuclear arms control became a staple of strategic stability between the US and its Cold War adversary, the Soviet Union. The same enterprise, evidenced by the recent extension of the New START Treaty, continues to play a stabilizing role in Russo-American relations. President Trump made it a vocal goal to involve China in an arms control agreement. Though unsuccessful, the Trump administration brought to the fore legitimate national security concerns, of which the Biden administration has tacitly recognized. Whether or not one agrees that China is the premier national security threat facing the US today, it would be folly to leave the issue of nuclear engagement between two global powers unaddressed. As such, in my thesis, I seek to move beyond a purely academic examination to propose tangible solutions to an impending national security challenge facing the United States. This paper provides conceptual guidance to American efforts to engage China in arms control, but also identifies key issues of concern, challenges rooted in ambiguity, and recommends concrete initiatives that might improve mutual strategic understanding. So first, I wanted to give a definition of arms control. According to NATO, it is the mutually agreed upon restraints or controls on the development, production, stockpiling, proliferation, deployment, and use of troops, small arms, conventional weapons, and weapons of mass destruction. And I think it's important to recognize that it's not just an abstract concept, but one that not only is very important for international relations, but one that is applicable to our everyday lives. Arms control was one of the main reasons, of which there were a number, that the United States and the Soviet Union could maintain discussions and also prevent conflict. And so to that end, arms control, again, improves stability between nations, but also provides a forum for communication, an avenue to addressing miscalculation, and a way to pursue risk reduction and escalation prevention. So in terms of how I constructed my paper and how I put it together, I read copious amounts of material from academic writings on Chinese nuclear doctrine to congressional testimony. But the primary fodder for my thesis was interviews. I conducted more than 20 interviews with career public servants, many of whom spent time at the highest levels of policymaking and were not only in the room for important conversations on China, nuclear strategy, and as part of international negotiations, but they shaped those very discussions. These included conversations with a senior diplomat at NATO, an assistant secretary of defense and undersecretaries of state, and a senior official at the National Security Council. These conversations also included experts at think tanks such as Brookings, CSIS, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, as well as academics at the MIT Security Studies Program and the Naval Postgraduate School. Concentrating my interviews with practitioners, though, was imperative to formulating practical policy recommendations of my own. And it becomes important to understand why China is not only reluctant to pursue arms control, but has rejected every overture for bilateral and trilateral arms control frameworks. The main justification put forth is simple, in that China's nuclear arsenal, as you can see, consists of roughly 350 warheads as of 2021. The arsenals of the US and Russia exceed that of China by an order of magnitude, and a substantial difference remains even when accounting for limits on deployment of nuclear weapons and delivery systems under the New START Treaty. Further, China views arms control as unnecessary given its no first use pledge and maintenance of a lean and effective nuclear force. If they believe their own pledge of no first use to be authentic, then why should arms control even be necessary? China also maintains a deep-seated distrust of the arms control enterprise, viewing it as a tool of the liberal world order, which seems to be inherently biased against China, in that it would limit China as a rising power. And why would China want to put those restrictions on themselves? There doesn't seem to be anything in it for them. Conversely, it needs to be addressed why China should not only be involved, but that what the objectives are of the US in trying to involve China. And while these two questions are slightly different, I think they have complementary answers. The US wants to secure its regional interests in the Indo-Pacific and internationally. China, as a rising power, poses a challenge to that, evidenced by its increasingly assertive behavior on a regional and global scale across any number of issues. Power is relative, and China's rapid nuclear modernization and development, the Pentagon projects China to double its nuclear stockpile over the next decade, is in part enabled by not being party to the very arms control agreements that restrict the US. Why should China engage, though? As US-China tensions grow, mechanisms are necessary to avoid miscalculation and reduce escalation risks that might arise in response to several plausible regional contingencies, such as Taiwan or Japan's Senkaku Islands. It would be in the interest of both nations to avoid nuclear exchange at virtually any cost. And if China wants to challenge US prestige in the long term, it should seek to prevent any incidents that could prove damaging in the short term. Also, candidly speaking, how many nuclear weapons does a nation even need? China, having the globe's third largest stockpile, should, or at least some believe that they should, have an obligation as a global stakeholder to engage responsibly on issues of arms control. So given the background I've provided, I'm going to go over a few of the policy recommendations I developed in my paper. First up, though, the crux of the issue between the US and China is issues relating to ambiguity that are destabilizing between the two countries. Ambiguity indicates inexactness or lack of clarity, and it's this very lack of clarity and gap in mutual understanding across a number of strategic nuclear issues that really contributes to destabilizing circumstances. In other words, this ambiguity creates conditions that are less stable and more conducive to escalation, miscalculation, and circumstances that would bring about conflict and/or nuclear exchange. This ambiguity is particularly difficult to address, not only because it exists across a number of issues, but because ambiguity also has some inherent strategic value. If, for example, a nation is unclear about an adversary's response, it might deter in some way an offensive action. In this case, though, I've determined that the destabilizing effects of ambiguity outweigh the strategic value that they provide. So just to identify a couple areas of concern and that fall under the umbrella of ambiguity. The US is not entirely sure about China's no first use policy. Are there contingencies during which China would employ nuclear weapons? First is a question that is on the mind of many American policymakers and analysts. China's proliferation of dual capable systems, in other words, weapons that can be both conventionally outfitted as well as nuclear outfitted, and the co-location of conventional and nuclear capabilities related to their command and control centers. Both of these issues are very serious in terms of an avenue for potential miscalculation as well as escalation. For China, ambiguity is rampant about the intent and competencies of US regional and strategic missile defense, conventional prompt global strike, and transparency related to verification and treaty compliance. So how to address these? And something I came across in my research is that many people believe if arms control in its traditional sense, the qualitative and quantitative limits on arms, is going to happen between the US and China, it won't happen for a number of years, if at all. So there needs to be a way to address this in the short term, because even if arms control were able to happen, for example, the Open Skies Treaty, a previous information sharing agreement, was first suggested by President Eisenhower in 1955, but didn't come to fruition until the early 2000s. So there has to be some way to address these causes for concern and ambiguity in the short term. So I've come up with what I've deemed as strategic understanding initiatives. These are designed to help dispel ambiguity around the issues previously referenced and also build mutual understanding. So I'll just briefly go over 6 of the ones I've selected from my paper. The first being a missile launch notification regime, which would allow the two countries to, like it says, notify when they have a missile test launch, and that could prevent any sort of miscommunication or a miscalculation based on having to try and figure out whether a launch is a test launch or an actual launch. 2, the observation of national ballistic missile defense testing and test site visitation, which is designed to allay Chinese concerns about the capabilities of US missile defense, regionally and internationally. 3, Chinese participation in New START inspections. New START, again, being the existing treaty between the United States and Russia. This would help China to improve their understanding of verification and treaty compliance, which is absolutely integral to actually enforcing an arms control treaty. 4, military-to-military exchange and community re-engagement, which is absolutely imperative to building a long-standing epistemic community, which has mutual understandings for the two countries. And 5 and 6, diminishing co-location and dual-use ambiguity, and coming to terms on some rules of the road on emerging technologies, which are super relevant and intertwined with many strategic nuclear issues. And so in brief, what is the intent of these strategic understanding initiatives beyond trying to improve mutual understanding and address ambiguities? These SUIs will become a forum for communication, an avenue for escalation reduction and preventing miscalculation, as well as, should a crisis arrive, a way to manage these crises. And so, in conclusion, arms control can and should serve as an important pillar of strategic stability between states, but in its traditional sense, this is a long way off for the US and China. That said, it's imperative to begin the process now, and that can happen through some of these shorter-term efforts and initiatives that I've proposed. Progress towards arms control, though, cannot be achieved without addressing mutually concerning areas of ambiguity as an avenue to building mutual understanding between the United States and China. Thank you, and I look forward to answering any and all questions.